Here we are in section 7-4, exercises 13 through 24. And on this, let's recall, we're dealing with I. And if you ever have a power bigger than 1, it will always simplify down. So I squared, I times I is -1. Let's remember that. So the square root of -1, that's what I is. And so I squared is -1. That's why it's imaginary. No number in the real world squared is going to give you a negative number. That's why we had to make up this imaginary unit. So I squared is -1, which helps you if you're ever higher than that. If you can always break it down into pairs, they become -1, normal, real number, an integer, very nice to deal with, except for that stinking negative sign. You also have the option, if you get two of those together, so an I to the 4th power is always going to be I squared times I squared, which is a +1, which is basically invisible when you're multiplying with numbers. So let's remember these as we go through 13 through 24. Okay, number 13, square root of -4, that is the square root of -1 times 2 times 2. So that's 2, and that is I. 2I. It's an imaginary number. The next one, square root of -49. That's 7 times 7, and that's a -1. So this is 7I. Yeah, it's just the square root of 49 is 7, and the square root of -1 is I. All right, the next one, number 15. Square root of -18. So 18 doesn't come out nice, and this is 2 times 3 times 3. So the 3 comes out of the square root sign, so this is 3. The -1 comes out, so that's an I, and then the 2 has to stay. So it's 3I square roots of 2. And sometimes that will be written as 3 times the square root of 2I, but you have to make sure the I isn't still under the square root if you write it that way. But complex numbers often get written as A plus BI, and in this case, this 3 square roots of 2 would be the B. So either way, it's all right, but just be aware that both of those are the same thing. Okay, let's try number 16. This is the square root of -1 times 3 times 5 times 5. So we get 5I square roots of 3, or you could write it as 5 square roots of 3I. Just make sure that I is not confused and possibly under that square root. Good. Next one. We have 2I times 7I. That is 14I squared. But what is I squared? -1. So this is actually -14. I guess I should write that out. I squared is -1. So -1 times 14 is -14. Good. And number 18. 5I times 6I, that's 30I squared. You'll never have I to any power bigger than 1 because I squared is -1. 30 times -1 is -30. Good. Okay, number 19. I squared. Well, I squared, oh, it's right there. I squared is -1. Good. Number 20, I to the 5th. So there are 5 i's timesing together. So this is I squared times I squared times I. That's how we get 5 of them. And look, I put this guy together, so that's a -1 times a -1 times I. So it simplifies down to just I. It's the exact same thing, just I. All right, 21. I to the 15th power. So there are 15 i's all put together. So let's group them into groups of 2 here. We get I squared, I squared, I squared, I squared. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 15. So we get a -1, -1. So that's going to be 1. -1, -1. There's another 1 times 1 times 1 times -1 times I. So that's just -1 times I. That's -I. Notice we could have done this a little bit differently and said, ooh, I squared is going to happen 7 times. So that's 14 i's counted for right there, and then the 15th is right there, and this is negative 1 to the 7th power, and that's kind of easy. Negative 1 to the 7th power, that's negative times negative, the odd number of times, so we get negative 1 times I. And so negative I is how we get that answer. Good. Number 22. I to the 110th power. Wow. Well, this is, let's use that trick we used right there. This is I squared to the 55th power with no remainder, no remaining i's left over. That is I, there's 110 of them, so if we break them up into groups of 2, because of square roots, so I squared of negative 1, so I squared comes out and becomes a negative 1. So this is negative 1 all to the 55th power. Negative 1 to an odd power is negative 1. There we go. All right, next one. Ew, I to the 459th power. Well, let's see how many we can get. I squared, if you divide this by 2, that's 200, and what is that, 28? Does that get us pretty close? 229, I guess. Let's divide that. 459 divided by 2, punch in a calculator just to make sure we don't mess up. That's 229, but then you also have 1 I left over. So 2 times 229 is 458. So notice I've accounted for all 459 i's here, but we did it in such a way because we know what I squared is. This is nice. I squared is negative 1, and that simplifies down over and over and over again. Negative 1 to an odd power is negative 1 times I, which is negative I. All right, number 24. I to the 2308. So let's do that trick one more time. We get I squared, and this is an even number, so 2308 divided by 2, and that's 1154. So here we have 2 times 1154 would give you 2308. So this actually accounts for all 2,308 i's multiplying together. So this is negative 1 to the 1154th power. So negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1. And all we have to do is know whether it's an even power or an odd power. Because if it's even, then negative 1 times negative 1 is a positive 1 times a negative 1 times a negative 1. So turns out to be a positive 1 because you have an even number of negatives. And notice that all the powers of I will turn out to be one of 4 options. It will either be I, negative 1, negative I, or 1. Those are the only options that are allowed with i's.